Hello, everybody, and welcome to my course or lecture here at the Whitney Museum virtually. Today, I'm going to take you through how landscape imagery informs and reflects American identity and how artists have documented, challenged, and even reimagined American space. And I'm going to look at all of this through or inspired by the lens of the Whitney's collection and the current exhibition on the sixth floor called Shifting Landscapes, which features work from 1965 to the present. So the exhibition seeks to expand our definition of landscape beyond traditional picturesque vistas. And what I've found in the exhibition are many examples where artists transgress, but also inherit the traditional understanding of American land originally found in landscape painting. So this presentation is going to go pretty far back into art history and show how this idea of the picturesque evolved from an 18th century aesthetic into a tool for shaping national identity, nostalgia, and even modern environmental concerns. So before we explore specific sections of the sixth floor exhibition, I'm going to establish a theoretical framework and an art historical context around landscapes. Again, beginning with this idea of the picturesque ideal that was imported from England to America in the 18th and 19th centuries. So William Gilpin, an English artist, educator, and cleric, popularized the idea of the picturesque in the late 18th century. His writings positioned this aesthetic category between the sublime and the beautiful. And this differs slightly from later Romantic paintings that would be more intense and would connect godly power to the natural landscape. So picturesque landscapes focused more on pleasing compositions rather than emotional intensity. For Gilpin, landscapes deserved to be painted if they showed roughness and irregularity and variety in the terrain. And he considered this distinctly British. So he would travel around Britain and write popular travelogues about his picturesque journeys through Scotland and Wales and the English countryside. And these inspired wealthy Englishmen to travel within Britain. And this would sometimes replace the traditional grand tour, where the same class of Englishmen would tour Italy as part of the education of a young upper-class man. And so the British picturesque paintings often featured medieval, Gothic, or prehistoric ruins that were in England rather than the classical ruins of Italy or even Renaissance architecture that you would find on the Grand Tour and in other types of painting. So we can immediately see how the picturesque landscape ideal has a nationalist angle. The picturesque also contains a sense of nostalgia. It keeps the past alive in the present through both ruins, but also vast open landscapes, which in this era were becoming increasingly rare. And this is because the genre emerged alongside industrialization and the enclosure movement, which was an ongoing movement that privatized community farmland. So enclosure involved putting up walls and fences around farmland that was previously open and shared by a community of rural people who now farmed privately owned land. So the picturesque in Britain was both an aesthetic style and a cultural viewpoint that was nationalistic and also pushed back against the modernization of a rapidly changing physical landscape. So some scholars even see the picturesque as a reaction against growing capitalism, particularly because of how they responded to the enclosure movement. So for example, Anne Birmingham's influential book, Landscape and Ideology, shows how British landscape painting made land ownership seem natural and inevitable during this period of enclosure. So a good example is John Constable's painting, The Hay Wain, which really illustrates this tension. It shows a nostalgic vision of a rural life that was rapidly disappearing. If we look at this painting, we can see how Constable blends the workers. We can see how he's blending the workers into this cart and into this natural landscape. And so they're part of the world, just like the trees or the small houses, rather than real people who are affected by this big economic and physical shift. And Constable emphasizes natural beauty, fleeting light, and the seemingly open countryside. So we pick up also, though, that he's longing for the pre-enclosure landscape. So by focusing on this harmonious small-scale labor, he erases enclosure's disruptions. We don't see the fences or divided fields or signs of any of this industrialized farming that were transforming rural England. So the picturesque tradition serves as what Birmingham calls an imagined recovery. So an imagined revival of vanishing rural scenes where nostalgia is a reaction to economic transformation. The nostalgic elements in Constable's paintings might suggest a critique of enclosure and privatization, since they're mourning the open landscape. But on the other hand, it also absorbs and neutralizes potential criticism of upheaval by idealizing these scenes. This isn't a French realist painting that might show the suffering of laborers. Instead, it's palatable. So we also see this contradiction within the picturesque in terms of national, social, and economic critique. It's worth noting a little bit of biography here. Constable was the son of a wealthy corn merchant and mill owner. So he grew up witnessing both traditional rural life and this increasing agricultural commoditization. So this is kind of a backdrop as the foundation for these tensions in his work. His paintings reflect both genuine attachment to the pre-enclosure movement or landscape and a depoliticized representation that made modernization more seamless. So we might see this implicit criticism in the nostalgic portrayal of the disappearing open landscape, but Birmingham suggests his work ultimately frames economic transformation in ways that reduce rather than strengthen an idea of resistance. So as the American picturesque evolved in England, it influenced American artists across the Atlantic, but with a really crucial difference, which I would say is the absence of ruins. So instead of putting ruins of that would show this kind of nationalism, American landscapes reflected expansionism as its form of nationalism. So American painters faced these landscapes that didn't have centuries of visible human history, at least not ones that they were willing to showcase, that defined English painting. And instead, they're doing kind of the opposite. They erased evidence of Indigenous Americans who had lived on the land that they're painting for centuries. So this forced American picturesque painters to develop new approaches to claim these seemingly untouched spaces as distinctly American, while maintaining that rugged, picturesque quality that connected to national identity and physical transformation already in terms of art history, or at least their recent cultural tradition. So while British picturesque paintings mask class disruption through nostalgic rural scenes, American landscape art serves a nationalist purpose of expansionist ideology. And they also are dealing with an emerging environmental concern in the wake of this rapid development. And we can see this in Thomas Cole's painting here, the Oxbow from 1836. It shows this transformation. We see the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts from the just after a big storm. And we get this juxtaposition between untamed wilderness on the left side and cultivated farmland on the right. So it's not just an aesthetic contrast, but we see these two competing visions of America's future. There's a visual tension between the conflicted relationship with progress and also this ideal of the rugged, unexplored, and unsettled natural land. So this has kind of historic fact to it. Cole painted the Oxbow partly as a response to critics who were looking at American landscape painting and saying that they were, quote, rude without picturesqueness. So they had that rugged quality, but without the picturesque, in part because they lacked Europe's ruins. And Cole instead celebrates that uniqueness of the American landscape through a true embrace of nature. The beautiful and sublime are united to show that the New World scenery could rival the Old World in beauty and meaning. The American landscape's remnants of the Old World is this large oak tree that appears here in the foreground, rather than a medieval castle, but it's even older than those picturesque ruins. So a different scholar, Angela Miller, argues that the Oxbow encapsulates these ideological tensions between westward expansion, which appears literally on the west side of the painting, which is why I put this little compass here in the slide, and the settled and enclosed farmland to the east. The artist even inscribes Hebrew letters into the hills far off in the distance, which suggests this divine oversight of the transformation of the land. And this is going to foreshadow more overt references to America's divine right to expand into the West in later Manifest Destiny paintings. So Cole's work encoded both expansionist ideology and this emerging environmental concern of the unchecked development that threatens things like that strong oak tree that is either uprooted or in great danger of being uprooted in the painting. And these environmental anxieties become increasingly prominent as American painters venture westward and further transform European traditions in response to that unique American landscape. So these two paintings, which are from a few decades later by Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Moran, continue this transformation of the English picturesque tradition into something more distinctly American and verging on the romantic as well. So these are maybe closer to the sublime than to the picturesque. And these artists weren't just documenting landscapes, but engaging with them as moral interpreters. These spectacular visions of the American West that simultaneously celebrated untamed wilderness, justified territorial expansion, and laid the groundwork for the national parks movement. So it's important in kind of this big arc of American art history that I'm going to go through, that both of these painters were early adopters of the conservationist movement in the US. Thomas Cole's painting, we can read a conservationist perspective into it, whereas Moran and Bierstadt were actual conservationists. So for example, this painting on the right, we see these invocations of God's glory, as well as this unique, rugged American landscape. But we get this selective vision. So on the right in the Thomas Moran painting, we do see the inclusion of Native American figures in the foreground, but they're positioned as small elements within the really vast landscape. They're also almost symbolic parts of the wilderness rather than representatives of actual Indigenous nationals and their real relationships to these lands. So while employing European conventions, these works established a new American iconography that balanced human presence with seemingly untamed and spectacularly grand wilderness. Moran's paintings played a very crucial role in these conservation efforts. The painting here on the right was historically actually instrumental in Congress's decision to establish Yellowstone as the nation's first national park. And these paintings would be reproduced as chromolithographs, so prints, and then widely distributed. So they helped Americans in the East, who were never going to go venture out westward, visualize these territories that they would never see in person, but could then picture as part of their national identity. So these are both natural and cultural landscapes that help justify manifest destiny and the seizure of Indigenous lands, in part under the guise of preserving this supposedly empty wilderness. And what connects these artists to that picturesque tradition is this selective composition. So choosing viewpoints and elements that create idealized versions of the changing landscape. So if Constable, the British artist, embeds those laborers into the landscape during enclosure that make them seamlessly just natural parts of that land, we see that Moran does the same thing with Indigenous people, where they become minute and integrated into the landscape. During this moment, in both cases, where that land is physically transforming. Excuse me. So paradoxically, this selective vision that omits or minimized human presence is also fostering this conservation effort. So moving towards more contemporary works, and even works that are in the Whitney's collection, we'll see how modern artists have grappled with and often deliberately subvert this complex situation of what they're inheriting visually from the picturesque tradition, as well as this relationship between national identity and the American West. So if we look at the American photographer Ansel Adams, he's maybe the most obvious inheritor of that painting tradition, taking the subject of the American West, but with a selective vision. So Adams also consciously positioned himself as a conservationist and used his photographs explicitly in campaigns to preserve these wilderness areas. So his 1941 photo, Clearing Winter Storm, Yosemite National Park, continues this picturesque tradition. We see the dramatic composition, but still the real landscape. There isn't quite an exaggeration that's achievable with romantic painting. And Adams is also using selective vision. He creates these idealized images of nature that omit human impact of roads or hotels or infrastructure, as well as of existing indigenous communities in the land that he's photographing. And all these American artists are participating in this conservationist tradition, but it's evolving over time. So maybe we can see this inherent contradiction in American landscape tradition, where that selective vision can both erase indigenous history and presences, but also create this cultural movement towards conservation. And then we're also selecting for what it is that is being conserved for this ideal and this ideology. It's the wilderness that's being conserved rather than something historical. So we've seen how this picturesque tradition, as it evolves in America, doesn't just reflect the land, but also shapes how Americans value it, first as a symbol of national identity and destiny, and then also as something precious to be preserved. So this might seem like kind of a radical comparison, but maybe I can convince you of its utility. Ansel Adams continued this picturesque and sublime tradition through these dramatic photos of untouched wilderness. And simultaneously, a painting art movement was, well, it was also photographic sometimes, but another art movement was developing a very different vision of the American landscape, but one that also would lack human figures and focus on monumentality as the point of the landscape image. So this movement is called Precisionism, which emerged in the 1920s and 30s. And the Precisionists turned away from natural vistas and focused instead on industrial and architectural landscapes that were rapidly transforming America in this part of the 20th century. So Precisionism is characterized by sharp-edged, geometrically simplified forms and smooth surfaces that celebrated American technological advances and industrial might. Artists like Charles Sheeler and Charles Demuth created these crisp, carefully constructed compositions of factories, grain elevators, which is the case of the example that I've brought, and urban scenes that have these geometric forms, but also this monumental industrial architecture that rivals the monumental mountains or wide open spaces of the American West. So the painting that I brought, you might recognize from the Whitney's collection. It's installed on the 7th floor. It's Charles Demuth's My Egypt from 1928. Like I said, it shows a grain elevator in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that towers over these nearby buildings. And the purpose of this piece of architecture is that it processes the harvest from the farmland of that American landscape, brings it to this one city town in towards the east of the country, and then sends it back out into that landscape as feed. So it creates this circular economy that depends on American land. And it has this monumental size. It also has these triangular overlays all over it. And this title, My Egypt. So all of these point to a comparison to the Egyptian pyramids, which we think of as the pinnacle of human engineering. But with this reference to the pyramids, Demuth gestures to the monumental ruins of the old and ancient world, the same ruins that would be considered picturesque in Europe and absent in America. So Demuth supersedes their impact with American modernity. We don't need the Egyptian ruins. We have this monumental glory instead. So whether Bierstadt and Moran celebrate America's natural wonders as evidence of divine providence and national destiny, the Precisionists celebrate human-made structures as symbols of American progress and industrial might. And there's another important similarity that I already talked about a little bit, but it kind of moves us into the Shiftings Landscapes exhibition. And that's again, this idea of selective vision. So the American Precisionists' clean, orderly depictions of factories and mills omitted labor struggles and environmental degradation and social inequities that go hand in hand with industrialization. Their work helped incorporate America's industrial landscape into that national mythology, transporting maybe these alienating factories and smokestacks into something of aesthetic glory and national pride. And we're going to see maybe this vein that moves across into the Shifting Landscapes exhibition in that treatment of the human figure. If the landscape painters are embedding the figures into the landscape, Ansel Adams and the Precisionists actually remove their presence in these images, as did the photographers who open up the Shifting Landscape exhibition with this section called altered topographies. So at last, I'll move into those works in the exhibition on the 6th floor, particularly 2 sections of the show that engage with art histories that stem from these picturesque, conservationist, and compositional traditions. So if you move through the exhibition right to left, as it's sometimes natural to do, you would begin with this section called Altered Topographies, and it gets its title from an exhibition from 1975 that codified a new approach to American landscape photography. And that exhibition was called New Topographics, Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape. And it featured works by 10 photographers, all of whom displayed photographs that were small black and white prints in simple frames with these really minimalistic mats. And they documented the industrialization and suburbanization of the American West, previously venerated by the artists that we've already looked at for that untouched wilderness that had come to symbolize an American sensibility. So at the Whitney's exhibition, their section includes photographs by Robert Adams that were originally in that 1975 exhibition. And looking at these 2 photographers, both of their last names are Adams. I don't think that they were related. We see that Ansel Adams's pristine wilderness is this transcendent sublime, and it's contrasted with Robert Adams's focus on tract houses or suburban developments and commercial strips. So what might look like a stark and apparent neutrality from Adams is actually embedded with a critical stance. By photographing suburban sprawl and commercial development with the same care that Ansel Adams gives to natural wonders in the American West, the new topographics artists challenge this romantic mythology. And I can draw this other comparison to the Precisionists again. So like the Precisionist painters, these images were notably devoid of human presence, as if all this industry is embedded or naturalized into that landscape without seeing anybody actually doing it. So the human impact is visible, but not the actual people. Those photographers, like Robert Adams, showed this landscape of industry rather than majestic mountains. And so we see this very different approach, this cool detachment and seeming objectivity. They abandon dramatic lighting or sweeping vistas for what appeared to be this documentary style. Their composition has this central frontality to it, and it embraces also flatness rather than a three-dimensionality that might allow for more emotional intensity. But there's also a clear environmental consciousness in this exhibition as well. So the subtitle of that 1975 exhibition is Photographs of a Manned Altered Landscape. So that puts human impact front and center as the theme of the exhibition. These photographers documented the rapid transformation of the American landscape and the suburban developments are encroaching on what was once this wide open view. So it's kind of similar to how John's Constable is showing this encroachment, or by omitting it, of the enclosure movement, that this is something that we mourn and that we lost, but maybe more similar to Thomas Cole, who has this stark juxtaposition between that settled land in the east and the untamed wilderness in the west. Here in Robert Adams, the two are really integrated. We have the juxtaposition that's all in one view, those mountains over in the background and the suburbanized house in the foreground. So Constable's using beauty to make change seem natural, but Adams is using this stark contrast between those mountains and the banal home to make us consider what's lost with this development that Cole, who I think rightfully is in the middle of these two, has as this kind of ongoing process, not something that's been settled and determined already. Moving along in that altered topographies section, we see works that deal with the question of human figures and absence and presence through not just the human body, but different types of ruins. Robert Adams's photographs are exhibited right next to videos by Nicole Soto Rodriguez that are called her Abandonment series. And in these videos, she dances in abandoned buildings, including the Hotel Normandy in Puerto Rico and Southwestern High School in Detroit. So these abandoned spaces represent economic collapse and failed development within the United States and also its territory. So unlike that detached objectivity and absence of human figures from Robert Adams and the New Topographics photographers, Rodriguez physically inserts herself into those compromised spaces. I wrote down a quote from her. She said, "I feel abandoned by a country that would not give me what I worked so hard for. I decided to submerge into that feeling and work with what could come out of that premise in a space no longer in use." So here we find a really interesting counterpoint to that picturesque tradition. Unlike the British tradition that sought ruins as this aesthetic focal point to evoke nostalgia while naturalizing economic disruption, Soto Rodriguez takes a kind of opposite approach. She doesn't make a detached view that's venerating decay. She instead physically enters these abandoned spaces and inserts life and movement to make economic and political abandonment more visible and tangible. So she uses analog video that preserves imperfections, and she'll create movements and patterns that don't just document or showcase this economic failure or governmental abandonment, but create ritual encounters with the physical remnants and force viewers to confront social and political history that abandonment represents, rather than seeing it as this beautiful national pride. And a work that is right next to Soto Rodriguez is Latoya Ruby Frazier's photograph, or dual photographed, maybe a diptych, called Landscapes of the Body, Epilepsy Test, which also reimagines what abandonment means in the American landscape. So on the left, we see this photo of her mother receiving tests and medical treatment for epilepsy, and on the right, the demolition of the UPMC Braddock Hospital. So Frazier's work often focuses on her hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is a collapsed steel mill town that has seen population decline throughout the photographer's whole life. The hospital shown was initially built to serve Braddock's population, and then was abandoned and reduced to ruins as a visual sign of the town's decline, and abandonment of government resources. So again, abandonment or ruins indicate actual economic and political history. And the final work I'll show in this section is this one by Cristina Fernandez. It more directly relates to those ruins that were initially aestheticized by Gilpin. It's a work called Bend, which is installed on an entire wall in the altered topographies section. The main subject is the Zapotec ruins in Oaxaca, Mexico, which are ruins because of European colonialism and expansionism in Mexico, although the Zapotec people are still an indigenous community there. So we see these large overarching photo of the ruin on the wall with 5 stark black and white photos in a straight line on top of it, similar to that documentary style of the original New Topographics exhibition. And there's a photo of Fernandez's own body in the middle, which is again reminiscent of that insertion of the body in both Soto Rodriguez and Frazier's work. Other than her body, of those 5 stark smaller photographs, they depict tombs that exist within and around this larger ruin. So text on the far right of the wall describes the artist encountering skeletal remains of a woman in a museum in Oaxaca that is then complemented by text on the far left that describes her Mexican grandmother's death in California, which she learned about while visiting the ruins. So here, ruins bridge personal and historic loss, and they extend this picturesque tradition that uses ruins to evoke nostalgia for that pre-industrial time while hiding ongoing economic changes. So Fernandez doesn't just beautify ruins for pleasure, but uses it to express this multi-generational grief that has to do with interventions politically and physically in the landscape. So if Roberts Adams documented what was lost in the American West, and Soto Rodriguez shows abandonment through dance in failed economic spaces, Fernandez shows landscape as a memorial to displacement caused loss. Maybe we could call this a critical picturesque that recognizes both visual appeal of ruins and their political significance. I need to move on to this next section of the exhibition, which is called Earthworks, where we'll find another 1970s movement of artists who took a more radical approach to the changing environment and museum installation. So rather than represent the landscape, these artists turned to direct intervention with the land itself. And we see this shift from documenting to intervening. And I'll show how that's an evolving continuation of the traditions we've been looking at. So just as Cole and Moran and both of the Adams were advocates of conservation, this generation of artists were really involved in the 1970s environmental movement. So this movement is also interchangeably called land art or earthworks, almost interchangeably. And it emerges with this environmental movement that shows this dramatic departure from traditional landscape art. One of the most well-known examples of land art is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is this 1,500-foot coil of rock and earth that extends into Utah's Great Salt Lake. So typically these would be massive in scale and fully integrated into their natural settings, and they would expose climate change as climate events happen, like the Great Salt Lake at one point fully submerged this work, and at another point it dried up, and then the work reemerged, and we see the impact of climate. So Nancy Holt's another important land artist who takes American landscape tradition into a new direction by bringing industrial material into the Western landscape. Her famous work, Sun Tunnels from 1978, is an example of this, where she took 4 huge concrete cylinders, each 18 feet wide, and put them into an X shape in Utah's Great Basin Desert. And she drilled small holes in the concrete that match the constellation patterns of the night sky. So when the sun shines through them, you can see the star patterns from within the tunnel during the daytime. And she uses concrete, this very industrial material, to create a magical experience in nature. So we have a new kind of version of the sublime. Where you see this continuation of these approaches where Constable makes economic change look natural, Robert Adams documents suburban sprawl, and then Holt is doing something completely different. She places industrial objects in nature to change how we're experiencing the landscape. Moving along, a work that's actually in the Earthworks section is Holt's Locator. And I think that it really inherits, though, the idea of sun tunnels, but in a museum-friendly form. Locator is a steel pipe that's displayed alongside an irregularly shaped black dot, and viewers can look through that pipe, and that irregular shape transforms into a perfect circle encased in a halo of light representing or resembling an eclipse. So similar to sun tunnels showing the night sky in daylight, Locator shows what it would be like to look at a solar eclipse, which is something that we can't actually do without making us go blind. And also in some ways that celestial transformative experience, you have to usually venture into that Western landscape to have that. Like I can never see night skies or the stars in New York City. So like Moran's paintings that were turned into these prints and distributed widely, Locator's also allowing viewers in the East to maybe experience this natural phenomenon in the West. And we see this continuation with the Precisionists, but I'm actually going to move on so that I have time for questions and answers. And I'm just going to look at one last work in the Shifting Landscapes exhibition, which is not actually part of that original 1970s earthwork movement, but it continues its legacy. So just as Holt's Locator brings the experience of sun tunnels into the museum, Maya Lin's Ghost Forest Baseline Y from 2022 translates a large-scale environmental installation into gallery form. So with Ghost Forest Baseline Y, Lin, who's an environmental activist as much as an artist, continues the tradition of artists using landscape to address environmental change. This piece originated from a 2021 site-specific installation in Madison Square Park, where she transplanted 49 Atlantic cedar trees that had died from saltwater intrusions caused by rising sea levels. And environmentalists call this a ghost forest. And they're expectedly increasingly common around the Atlantic coastline as climate change advances. So for the museum version, Lynn cut sections of these dead trees that were originally inserted into the city and echoes their installation in the museum. So we see a really different approach to that conservation tradition. Instead of presenting this idealized vision of nature, she shows this counter monument to climate change. These dead trees move from their original context and transform into art objects, and they act as this warning or witness. So you can find this connection really directly with the dead oak in Cole's painting, or the dying oak at least, which juxtaposes that built environment that's encroaching onto the natural world. In Lynn's, she brings the natural world and that dead tree into that built environment in New York. So you see the similar juxtaposition where dead, damaged trees contrast a built environment that we would otherwise not really think twice about. And we see another through line in this contemporary work with this idea of ruins. The British picturesque was invested in these crumbling castles and abbeys that had this focal point as nostalgia and as the imagined recovery, where scenes are being lost to industrialization, but almost made palatable through these picturesque vistas. And Maya Lin, again, reimagines the ruin. So the dead cedar trees function as an environmental ruin, not just of human architecture, but of an ecosystem that's damaged by climate change, perhaps caused by human architecture. And we can see these more connections to the ruins that I pointed out throughout this lecture. So like in the altered topographies section, Nicole Soto Rodriguez's abandonment works, both of these artists engage with ruins, but from different perspectives. Rodriguez dances in abandoned buildings that testify to economic collapse and failed industrial initiatives, and Lynn's dead trees similarly testify to environmental collapse and failed climate policies, but do so with this physical insertion into the Whitney Museum. And so we see this picturesque tradition that turns ruins from pleasant reminders of historic continuity to these testaments of political abandonment and change. So all three of these works reject that comfortable tradition of the picturesque and expose forms of abandonment that would otherwise remain abstract. Their work shows how landscape representation has evolved from documentation of pristine vistas to this active engagement with personal and cultural and environmental loss. Now here's my last slide. Just to kind of make this trajectory of the art history that I've drawn, we see this evolution from that original picturesque, a aesthetic between the sublime and the beautiful that celebrated roughness and irregularity and helped the British process dramatic social change. And then throughout American art history, this tradition is continually reimagined. Thomas Cole's Oxbow reveals the tensions between wilderness and settled land. Bierstadt and Moran created spectacular visions that justified expansion, but also sparked conservation. Ansel Adams idealized wilderness by omitting human presence. Robert Adams inverted the tradition by documenting suburban developments and abandoning romanticization. Soto Rodriguez, Fernandez, and Latoya Ruby Frazier all explore economic ruins through embodied presence and putting the body there. And then Nancy Holt works use industrial material to make new ways of seeing landscapes. And then finally, Maya Lin's Ghost Forests brings it all full circle. Like the original picturesque that valued ruins as aesthetic focal points, Lin presents dead cedar trees as contemporary ruins of ecosystems damaged by human activity. So what began as this way to aestheticize landscape during periods of economic transformation evolves into this visual language that helps us process the current social, political, environmental, and economic crises. So these contemporary artists inherit that picturesque tradition to expose rather than mask the consequences of our relationship with the land and show us these visual strategies to confront our own moment of different types of reckoning with American identity. I'm glad I finished in time for questions, which I do see in the chat. I'm going to read them over and field them myself, so just bear with me. Jake asked, does the American picturesque painting have parallels with the group of 7 landscapes in terms of expansion? Yes, so I think that was answered, that was asked towards the beginning of the lecture, maybe before I got into that idea of expanding out west and that picturesque having this manifest destiny to it as well, but that tradition really continuing and not being fully what we would imagine as European romantic painting that's more imaginative, but both maintaining picturesque and having this idea of expansion and godly right. An erasure process in Precisionism. That's an interesting question. Sorry, somebody asked, do you have thoughts on whether there was an erasure process in Precisionism? Is Native American influence on the land? It's not something I've thought of before, but we could, of course, read these critically and say that this entire built environment is a complete transformation from the historic environments that were there previously. So the precisionist landscapes really have no nature in them whatsoever. And any remnant of Indigenous people is built over or completely superseded on, rather than maybe these 2 tiny Indigenous figures that we might see in the Thomas Moran. Tony asked she says, a truly brilliant overview. Thank you. Thank you. What might come next? Other kinds of ruins? What other kinds of art? I think this is why it is easy for an art historian to not be an artist. I am excited to see what comes next. I've really been fixated on this Maya Lin work as maybe, I think, kind of like the grounding logic of how I've been approaching this exhibition, although it's an exhibition that's going to be up for a really long time, and I'll see constantly new things, but in creating this lecture, that idea of ruins has been very interesting to me. So I hope that maybe I start looking at works in this exhibition and more generally looking for kind of more connections to that idea of ruins and nationalism. Sarah wants to know if any works in the exhibition that talk to otherness or othering that American policy throughout history is implemented. Yes, definitely. So, for example, the relationships of not contiguous United States and territories, US lands that have historically spilled into Canada or Mexico, but intentionally Americanized. Yes. So it is a huge, it's a really large exhibition, and there are various sections. There's an entire section of the exhibition called Borderlands that is specifically interested in the US-Mexico border and the almost magical space in between that a border creates. And certainly the American encroachment on Mexico, or the ways in which Mexican American artists might have these dueling identities between the two. Don't know of one off the top of my head that addresses Canada, but again, it's large. I haven't memorized all of them. But I would say that also the exhibition deals with American expansionism beyond even the Americas. So there's a photo of 29 Palms in California that's from 2004, showing soldiers training for the invasion of Afghanistan, and this idea of transforming California into a version of the Middle East for expansionist, or you could argue expansionist ideology. Okay, well, now I feel a little bad because there's another 1 minute for rushing at the very end, but we do what we can. Thank you so much for joining me and for these really thoughtful questions. I am going to just end my presentation, and thank you for joining us.